The night Elias Colt found Clara Mayfield curled up on his kitchen floor, with nothing but a worn horse blanket pulled over her shoulders, he knew his quiet life in the mountains was never going to be the same again. It was the autumn of 1873, and the Montana Territory was already showing its teeth. The first hard frosts had come down from the Beartooth Range 3 weeks earlier than anyone expected, coating the pine boughs with a crystalline layer of ice that caught the moonlight like scattered diamonds. The logging camp where Elias served as the resident mountain man, trapper, and all-around problem solver sat at the eastern edge of a wide timber valley, and the men who worked that valley were rough, loud, and perpetually hungry. Hunger was the one thing Elias could not fix with his own 2 hands, which was precisely why the camp foreman, a ruddy-faced Irishman named Donald Brannigan, had placed an advertisement in the Billings Gazette seeking a cook willing to work the season in exchange for fair wages and board. Clara Mayfield had answered that advertisement not because she was particularly adventurous, but because she was entirely out of options. She had arrived 3 days before the incident that changed everything, brought up the mountain trail in the back of the supply wagon driven by old Pete Hensley, who chewed tobacco from sunup to sundown and said exactly nothing during the entire 6-hour ride from Billings. Clara had sat in the wagon bed surrounded by sacks of dried beans and flour, her small trunk wedged between a crate of canned peaches and a roll of canvas tarp, and she had watched the landscape transform from the flat golden plains into something wilder and more vertical, the kind of country that made you feel very small and very temporary. She was 23 years old, and she had been a cook in various capacities since she was 15, first in her mother's boarding house in Missouri, then in a hotel kitchen in Kansas City after her mother passed, and most recently in the back of a cattle drive chuck wagon that had ended badly when the trail boss ran off with the ranch owner's daughter and left 14 cowboys stranded in the middle of the Wyoming grasslands with no pay and no direction. Clara had made her way to Billings on pure stubbornness, spent her last $4 on a room at the Imperial Hotel, and answered the advertisement the very morning it ran. The cook's quarters were a small room attached to the back of the main cookhouse, barely large enough for a cot, a washstand, and a single peg on the wall where she could hang her coat. The cot itself was a relic of dubious origin, its rope frame so stretched and uneven that sleeping on it was something akin to sleeping in a hammock that had developed a grudge against the human body. Clara had spent the first 2 nights tossing and turning, waking with her hip bones aching and her back knotted into something resembling a fist, and by the 3rd night she had made a quiet, practical decision. She pulled the blanket off the cot, folded it twice for padding, and laid herself down on the smooth wood planks of the cookhouse floor, where at least the surface was consistent and her spine could lie straight. She had not planned on anyone finding her there. Elias Colt did not sleep much. This was not a complaint. It was simply a fact of his nature, the same way some men could not carry a tune or some horses could not abide water crossings. He woke before dawn most mornings with the peculiar alertness of a man who had spent the better part of a decade reading the wilderness, and he used those quiet hours to check his traps along the lower creek line, assess the weather coming over the ridge, and generally take stock of the world before it woke up and got complicated. On this particular morning, the 4th of October, 1873, he had come down from his cabin, a solid, well-built structure he had raised himself 3 years prior at the north edge of the camp, because he had noticed the night before that the cookhouse stovepipe had been throwing sparks, and a stovepipe throwing sparks this close to a timber camp was the kind of thing that kept a man from sleeping entirely. He carried a lantern in his left hand and his tools in his right, a coil of wire and a length of iron rod that would let him reset the damper from outside if the flashing had come loose. He was a large man, Elias Colt, in the way that the mountains themselves were large, not excessively tall, perhaps 2 inches over 6 feet, but built with a breadth and solidity that suggested the bones beneath were made of something denser than ordinary calcium. His shoulders were wide enough that he had to angle himself slightly when passing through standard door frames, and his forearms, perpetually darkened by sun and exposure, were corded with muscle developed not in any gymnasium, but through the simple, relentless labor of wilderness living. His hair was dark brown and longer than was fashionable, reaching just past his collar because he cut it when it became inconvenient and not before. He had a jaw like a shelf of granite and dark eyes that moved slowly and saw everything. He came around the side of the cookhouse, checked the pipe flashing with his lantern. Sure enough, the wire clamp had worked loose in the frost and fixed it in under 10 minutes. He should have gone back to his cabin then. He would later think about that, the precise moment when he could have turned around and gone back up the slope and let the morning be as ordinary as any other. Instead, because he was a thorough man, and thoroughness had kept him alive in the mountains for nearly 12 years, he decided to look in through the cookhouse window to make sure the stovepipe situation had not caused any smoldering inside. What he saw through the wavy glass of that window stopped him as completely as if he had walked into a wall. Clara Mayfield was lying on the cookhouse floor, not slumped, not collapsed, clearly asleep, deliberately arranged, with her blanket folded beneath her and her coat drawn over her like a second covering. Her dark hair spread across her arm where she had made a pillow of it, her face quiet and composed in the way that only true exhaustion can quiet a face. She was wearing her work dress, a plain gray cotton affair that was already 2 washes past fresh, and her boots, good, practical boots, the kind a working woman wore, were set neatly side by side against the wall, which for some reason struck Elias harder than anything else. The tidiness of it, the small, deliberate dignity of placing her boots neatly despite sleeping on a floor. He stood at that window for a long moment, long enough for the cold to work through his flannel shirt and remind him that it was 4 in the morning in October in Montana. Then he went inside. The cookhouse was warm, at least, which was something. The stove had been banked low but efficiently, the kind of fire that would hold through the night and be ready for stoking come morning. There were good signs of competence everywhere he looked. The cast iron pots hanging from their hooks in descending order of size, the flour sacks sealed against mice, a row of onions braided and hung by the window, a careful arrangement of spices on the shelf above the work table. Clara had been there 3 days, and she had already organized the place into something that worked. He looked down at her sleeping on the floor, and something moved in his chest that he did not immediately have a name for. Elias Colt had been a solitary man by design, not by bitterness, not by wound, but by genuine preference, and the quiet conviction that the mountains asked something of a man that was incompatible with the domestic machinery of town life. He had been engaged once, a long time ago, to a woman in Helena named Margaret, but Margaret had wanted what the town offered, and Elias had wanted what lay above the tree line, and eventually they had both understood that wanting different things did not mean either of them was wrong. He had been 26 then. He was 34 now, and he had not given much thought to the absence of anyone, because the mountains are very good at filling up the silence. But standing in that cookhouse, looking at a woman who had arranged her boots with care before lying down on a hard floor, something moved in him that the mountains had not filled. He went to his cabin and came back with his own mattress. It was not a small undertaking. His mattress was a good one, stuffed with fresh hay and covered in ticking canvas, and it weighed enough to make even Elias work as he wrestled it off his bed frame, out through the cabin door and down the slope to the cookhouse. He moved quietly, the kind of quiet a man develops after years of moving through terrain where noise was the difference between a full trap line and an empty one. He edged the cookhouse door open with his shoulder and carried the mattress inside. He stopped. He could not simply put the mattress on the floor beside her without waking her, and waking her at this hour seemed wrong, the way breaking an animal's trail seemed wrong, the way a loud voice in a snow-quiet valley seemed wrong. So he did the only sensible thing. He set the mattress down in the cleanest corner, gathered the 2 flour sacks he found near the door, and fashioned something approximating a clean pillowcase from a square of canvas he found among the supply stores. Then he crouched beside where Clara slept, moving with the slow deliberateness of a man who has stalked elk in 2 feet of snow, and he very carefully slid his hands beneath the folded blanket she was lying on, raised her. She was lighter than he expected, and something about that tightened his throat and carried her to the mattress. She stirred only once, a small questioning sound, and then settled deeper into the warmth. Elias covered her with a second blanket he found on the supply shelf, still in its wrapping, unused. He tucked it around her the way he imagined a careful person would, which was to say imperfectly but with considerable intention. He set her boots at the edge of the mattress where she would see them when she woke. Then he went back to his cabin, lay down on his bare bed frame, and stared at the ceiling until dawn. Clara woke before the sun had fully crested the mountains, as was her habit, and for a moment she lay perfectly still and tried to understand what had happened to the floor. The surface beneath her was soft. She was warm in a way she had not been warm since before Kansas City. There was a blanket over her that she did not own, thick wool, still smelling faintly of cedar storage. She sat up slowly, and when she saw the mattress beneath her, the neatly placed boots, the canvas pillow, she felt something rush up through her chest and burn behind her eyes, sudden and unannounced, the way grief sometimes arrives, not in response to pain, but to unexpected gentleness. She pressed her fingers to her mouth and sat there on that mattress in the quiet cookhouse with the early light beginning to push through the wavy glass windows. And she cried. Not loudly, not for long. She was not a woman who permitted herself extended displays, but genuinely, from some deep place that had been storing up the exhaustion and the loneliness and the continuous difficulty of being a woman alone in a world that did not make that particularly easy. She cried for her mother's boarding house, gone to a bank in 1868. She cried for the cattle drive that had ended in the Wyoming grass. She cried because someone, she did not yet know who, had seen her sleeping on a floor and had not laughed or walked away, but had instead done something quiet and careful and entirely without expectation of acknowledgement. She dried her eyes with the back of her wrist, stood up, and started the morning fire. There were 22 men in this camp who needed breakfast, and she was going to give them the best breakfast any of them had ever eaten in a logging camp in Montana. Elias appeared at the cookhouse door at 6:30, as he did most mornings, to collect his breakfast before the rest of the men came through. This was a habit he had developed not out of rank. He held no official rank in the camp. He was simply the man everyone went to when the mountains caused trouble, but out of the simple reality that he was usually already done with half a day's work before the other men finished their coffee. He pushed the door open and stopped. The smell hit him first. Bacon. Proper bacon, not the half-rancid salt pork he had been tolerating for weeks, but actual good bacon sizzling in a clean skillet, hotcakes on the griddle, a pot of oats with something brown and sweet worked through it. Brown sugar? Had there been brown sugar in the stores? He had not thought so, but Clara had apparently found it. There was coffee, and it smelled like real coffee rather than the boot-leather approximation the camp had been surviving on. And there was a bowl of dried apples that had been reconstituted and spiced with something he could not immediately identify. Clara was standing at the stove with her back to him, moving with the efficient, unhurried competence of someone who had been managing large-scale cooking her entire life. She was wearing a clean apron over her work dress, and her dark hair was pinned up at the back of her neck, and she had not heard him come in over the sound of the skillet. He cleared his throat. She turned, and for a brief moment they simply looked at each other. She had gray eyes, he noticed, not the pale, washed-out gray of an overcast sky, but a darker, more deliberate gray, the color of mountain granite in the early morning. There was still the faint evidence of recent emotion at the edges of her eyes, redness she had not entirely managed to conceal, but her expression was composed and direct. "Good morning," she said. "Sit down. Coffee's ready." He sat, which was not something he did easily in the presence of strangers, and she poured his coffee without asking how he took it, which turned out to be exactly as he took it. He wrapped his large hands around the tin mug and looked at the table. "The mattress," he said. "Yes," she said, turning back to the stove. "The cot they gave you is no good." "No," she agreed. "It isn't. I'll get you a better one from the supply shed. There should be a frame in there that Brannigan bought last spring for the foreman's quarters before he changed his mind about expanding." He paused. "I'll set it up this afternoon." Clara kept her back to him, but he saw her hands still on the skillet handle for just a moment. "That's very kind of you," she said, and her voice was steady and professional and gave nothing away except to someone who was paying particular attention. Elias was paying particular attention. "I'm Elias Colt," he said. "I know who you are," she said. "Old Pete told me on the way up. He said you were the one who pulled 3 men out of a snow collapse on the North Ridge last February. Pete talks more than you'd expect. Only about things that matter." She plated his breakfast and set it in front of him, with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times, and then she went back to the stove to start the next batch for the men who would be coming through in 20 minutes. "I'm Clara Mayfield." "I know," he said. "Brannigan told me you were coming. He took a bite of the hotcakes and stopped chewing for a moment to appreciate what was happening on his tongue. They were light and slightly sweet and entirely unlike anything that had come out of this cookhouse before. "These are very good," he said, which for Elias Colt constituted a significant declaration. "Thank you," she said simply, and something about the way she said it, no deflection, no false modesty, just clean acceptance, made him want to say more things she would accept the same way. He did not. He finished his breakfast, brought his dishes to the wash basin without being asked, and was out the door before the first wave of loggers arrived. But he looked back once from the doorway, and she happened to turn at that moment, and they held each other's gaze for a beat that was one beat longer than necessary. He spent the rest of the morning checking trap lines and thinking about gray eyes. The better cot frame was retrieved from the supply shed that afternoon, as promised, and Elias hauled it to the cookhouse himself, which caused a certain amount of commentary from the loggers, who were men of the type who noticed everything and spoke about most of it. Donald Brannigan, watching from the door of the foreman's office, raised an eyebrow approximately 1/2 of an inch and said nothing, which for Brannigan was equivalent to a lengthy editorial statement. Two of the younger loggers, brothers named Will and Tom Hartley from Minnesota, made comments of a variety that caused Elias to look at them with the specific calm expression that experienced men in violent country learn to read as a warning. The comments stopped. The cot frame was set up in Clara's room, and Elias's mattress was placed upon it, and he added a second blanket from his own stores and said nothing about any of it. Clara thanked him briefly and efficiently when he brought the completed setup to her attention, and then she went back to the enormous pot of elk stew she was developing for supper, which was already filling the entire cookhouse with something extraordinary. That elk stew became a subject of conversation at supper that lasted longer than any other topic had lasted at that table since Will Hartley had accused his brother Tom of cheating at cards 3 weeks prior. Men who had been eating camp food for months sat in stunned silence over their bowls before erupting into an appreciation that was loud, genuine, and somewhat embarrassing in its sincerity. Old Pete Hensley, who had driven the supply wagon for this camp for 4 years and had the digestive memories to compare, declared it the finest thing he had eaten in the Montana Territory since 1869, a pronouncement he offered with the solemnity of a judge delivering a sentence. Clara received all of this with quiet dignity, refilling bowls and keeping the breadbasket moving down the table, and if she was pleased, she kept it internal, which Elias noticed was a consistent habit with her. She kept things internal. She observed more than she spoke. She had, he was beginning to understand, a quality that he recognized because he possessed it himself, a careful economy of self, a measured allocation of trust. He found himself watching her from his end of the table, the way he watched the tree line, not because he was looking for danger, but because he could not quite look away. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that Elias had not anticipated and found himself protecting with an unusual care. Every morning before the camp woke, he made his rounds, and most mornings he found some excuse to pass through the cookhouse, ostensibly to check on the stovepipe, or to report on the weather coming over the ridge, or to discuss whatever supply needs Clara had identified that old Pete could bring on his next trip down the mountain. These excuses were transparent to anyone paying attention, which in this camp meant essentially everyone. But Elias was not a man given to self-consciousness about his intentions once he had examined them honestly and found them decent. Clara, for her part, always had coffee ready when he appeared, which was either a coincidence of timing or a small, deliberate act of welcome that he turned over in his mind during his morning walks and could not conclusively resolve. They talked. This was perhaps the most surprising development for both of them, given that they were not, by temperament, talkers. But there was something about the early morning cookhouse, the stove warmth, the particular quality of the blue-gray light through those wavy windows, the knowledge that the camp was still asleep, and they had this hour to themselves, that loosened something in both of them. She told him about her mother's boarding house in Missouri, about the specific geography of cooking for a dozen different types of men at once, and learning to read what each one actually needed, as opposed to what he asked for. She told him about the Kansas City Hotel and the head chef there, a French-trained man named Beaumont, who had initially been contemptuous of her and eventually become something close to a mentor, who had taught her that bread was a philosophy and that patience was the essential ingredient in everything. She told him about the cattle drive with the careless, charming trail boss, and her voice, when she spoke of that particular chapter, had the flat, carefully neutral tone of someone who has processed something sufficiently to be at peace with it without needing to revisit the details. He told her about the mountains with a specificity and love that surprised even him in the telling. He described the particular silence of the high ridge in February, the silence that had texture, that pressed against your ears and your thoughts alike. He told her about the snow collapse on the North Ridge, 3 men buried in the slide, and Elias had dug for 40 minutes with his bare hands after his shovel handle snapped, and he had found all 3 alive, which he described not as heroism, but as a logistical problem that had to be solved before the cold finished what the snow had started. He told her about his cabin, the way he had built it over 2 summers, every log chosen and placed with deliberation, and about the view from his porch at dawn when the mist lay in the valley below and the peaks caught the first light and the whole world looked entirely possible. She listened to him describe that view with her hands wrapped around her coffee mug and her gray eyes on him with an attention that he felt physically, somewhere in the region of his sternum. "That sounds like somewhere a person could stay," she said after a moment. "It is," he said simply. Brannigan observed all of this with the broad, comfortable tolerance of a man who ran a functional camp and had no interest in disrupting anything that was working. The food had improved so dramatically since Clara's arrival that the loggers were working better. A well-fed man is a more focused man, and Brannigan had been doing this long enough to know it. If Elias Colt was suddenly finding reasons to linger at the cookhouse, well, that was Elias's business, and anything that kept Elias happy was, by extension, good for the mountain. October deepened toward November, and the cold that had been merely brisk became serious. The passes were beginning to ice. Pete Hensley came up twice more with supplies before announcing that the next trip would likely be his last until spring thaw, which meant Clara spent 3 days doing intensive inventory and drafting a supply list that would need to sustain 22 men through a Montana winter. She presented the list to Brannigan with the methodical competence of someone who had planned large-scale provisioning before, and Brannigan looked it over and signed off on it without a single revision, which he told Elias afterward was a first in his 17 years of running camps. It was during this period, the busy, rattling urgency of the pre-winter preparation, that something shifted between Elias and Clara in a way that went beyond the morning conversations and the careful morning coffee. It happened simply enough. Clara was on a step stool reaching for the upper supply shelf to take inventory. The stool was old, and one leg had a split in it that nobody had gotten around to addressing, and the leg gave way. She came down fast, and Elias was across the cookhouse before the stool clattered, catching her with both arms, and she was suddenly pressed against his chest with his arms around her and her hands gripping his forearms, which were, she registered with some part of her brain that was working independently of the situation, like gripping 2 sections of river cable. They were both very still for a moment. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. He had not been this close to anyone in a very long time, and she could feel the steadiness of his heartbeat against her shoulder, a deep, unhurried rhythm that was somehow the most calming thing she had encountered in years. His eyes, which she had categorized as dark brown, she now saw contained a warmth that she had not noticed from the other side of a cookhouse, something amber and lit, the color of firelight through glass. "The stool," she said. Her voice came out slightly different than she intended. "I'll fix it," he said. His voice was the same as always, low and level, but there was a quality in it, a thickness, that had not been there a moment ago. He set her down carefully, the way he had carried her that first morning, with a deliberateness that spoke of both physical awareness and restraint, and he stepped back and looked at the broken stool with the attention he might give a complex piece of trail machinery. Clara smoothed her apron and resumed her inventory list, and neither of them mentioned it, but the space between them in the cookhouse for the rest of that afternoon had a different quality, charged and warm, like the air before a lightning storm that never quite breaks. That evening, Elias fixed the stool. He also, while he was at it, fixed 2 shelving brackets that had been coming loose, reinforced the heavy door that swelled in the cold and had been requiring too much force to close, and replaced the broken handle on the water pump. He did all of this without commentary and without being asked. Clara came out of her room at one point during this project, observed him working with the focus of a man who did not do anything by halves, and went back inside and sat on her fixed-up cot in the dark for a while, pressing her palms flat against her thighs and breathing with deliberate steadiness. She had not come to the mountains to fall in love. She had come to the mountains to survive the winter and save enough to establish something permanent, perhaps a small restaurant in a growing town, perhaps a boarding house kitchen of her own, a life that belonged entirely to herself in a world that was consistently trying to make belonging to oneself more difficult than it ought to be. She had a plan, clear and practical, and it did not include the development of significant feelings for a mountain man who had dark amber eyes and carried her when she was sleeping and fixed things at night without speaking. She sat on her cot and thought about her plan for a long time, and the plan remained perfectly logical and entirely uninspiring, and she lay down and went to sleep. November arrived with a ferocity that even the experienced men in camp received with expressions of respectful unease. The first genuine blizzard came on the 6th of November, a wind that drove the snow horizontal and reduced visibility to the length of an arm, and the camp went still for 2 days while the storm had its way with the world outside the cabin walls. During those 2 days, Elias did not leave the main camp area. He had a rope line rigged between the key buildings, a winter precaution he had implemented the previous year after a logger became disoriented between the bunkhouse and the outhouse in a storm, and spent a very educational 40 minutes finding his way back. And he spent the time ensuring that the buildings were secure, the livestock sheltered, and the fire situations in every structure appropriate for extended occupancy. He knocked on the cookhouse door on the evening of the first storm day, carrying a load of extra firewood he had retrieved from the covered woodpile, and Clara opened the door looking faintly surprised but quickly moved aside to let him in out of the wind. He stacked the wood beside the stove with efficient precision and then straightened and looked around the cookhouse with the automatic assessment of a man checking conditions. "You have enough flour?" he asked. "Yes, I always account for storm days." She paused. "Would you like to eat here, rather than go back through that?" He looked at the door, where the wind was audible as a physical thing, a low, sustained roar with intermittent higher notes when it found a gap in the structure. "I would," he said. They ate together at the long cookhouse table, with the storm making its considerable noise outside, and the stove making the cookhouse an island of warmth in the cold mountain dark, and something about the domestic simplicity of it. 2 plates, 2 mugs of coffee, the storm held outside by good log construction and a hot fire, made Elias aware of how much he had accommodated his own loneliness, the way you accommodate a slight limp, adjusting to it so thoroughly that you forget what walking without it felt like. He watched Clara eat and talk and laugh once, genuinely, at something he said about the logistics of keeping a mule calm in a blizzard, and the laugh surprised them both slightly, because she was sparing with it, which made it worth considerably more than a more common laugh. She had a way of tilting her head when she was thinking, and a way of straightening it when she had arrived at a conclusion, and he was cataloging these things with the same thoroughness he applied to tracking, which told him something important about the state of his inner landscape. "Can I ask you something?" she said near the end of the meal. "Yes," he said. "The morning you found me sleeping on the floor." She looked at him steadily. "How did you carry me to the mattress without waking me?" He considered the question genuinely. "I moved slowly," he said, "and you were very deeply asleep." He paused. "When did you sleep last before that night?" She thought about it. Properly. Probably since Kansas City. She traced the edge of her mug with one finger. That was a few months ago. Something crossed his face, not exactly anger, more like the particular quality of stillness a man produces when he is managing a strong feeling. "The camp should have had a decent cot waiting for you." "A lot of things should be a lot of ways," she said matter-of-factly. "I'm fine. I've been fine since." A brief pause. "Because of you." They looked at each other across the table, and the storm roared and the stove ticked, and Elias felt the moment with a precision that was almost physical, the awareness of being exactly where something important was happening. "I'm glad," he said, which was true and also far less than what he meant, but it was what he had available at the moment. She nodded, as if this were sufficient, which perhaps for now it was. "More coffee?" she asked. "Yes," he said, and he meant that too, and stayed another hour. The storm passed and the mountains settled into the deepening cold of a Montana November, and Elias found himself restructuring his days in ways that he would have recognized had he been observing himself from the outside as accommodations. He began splitting the cookhouse woodpile as a morning task rather than leaving it to the general camp labor pool, not because no one else would do it, but because doing it himself meant he could ensure the pile was properly stacked for drying, maintained at the right height for easy access, and restocked before Clara would need to ask for it. He checked the cookhouse chimney every 3 days against the standard weekly inspection he gave the other buildings. When he went out to check his traps and brought back game, which he did consistently, a skill that still struck the loggers as something between impressive and mildly uncanny. He began leaving the best cuts at the cookhouse door, skinned and cleaned, because Clara would know what to do with them better than anyone, which was true, and also because the expression on her face when she found a good fresh cut of venison on her step in the morning was something he had decided, in the privacy of his own thinking, that he wanted to keep seeing. She began leaving a plate of food covered with a second plate on the cookhouse table when she knew he would come in after dark from a long trapping circuit. This was a practical act. It was also, Elias understood completely, something more than practical, and he ate those late-night plates alone in the warm cookhouse and felt something in his chest that was equal parts contentment and the particular ache of a man who is beginning to want more than he has. It was Brannigan who said it out loud first, which Elias supposed was inevitable. He cornered Elias by the woodpile one morning with the directness particular to Irishmen who have known a man long enough to dispense with preamble. "You're going to do something about this before she decides you're not going to do something about it," Brannigan said. Elias split a log with a single clean swing. "Do something about what?" "Do not give me that, Elias Colt. I've known you 4 years, and I've never seen you fix a woman's door hinges. I've never seen you split cookhouse wood before your own." Brannigan's expression was amused but not unkind. "She's a fine woman, and she's going to get herself offered a position at a proper hotel kitchen in Billings before spring, and you'll be sitting up in that cabin talking to your traps." Elias set the axe into the chopping block and looked at Brannigan with the particular focused calm that meant he was taking something seriously. "I know what I'm doing," he said. "Do you?" A pause. The cold air moved between the pines. "I know what I want to do," Elias said. "I'm being careful." "She's not made of thin ice," Brannigan said. "She crossed Wyoming territory alone after being abandoned by a trail boss. She answered an advertisement to cook for a mountain logging camp in October. She's not thin ice." Elias looked at the mountain. "No," he said, "she's not." He thought about the conversation for the rest of the day and was still thinking about it when he came into the cookhouse that evening to find Clara not cooking, but sitting at the far end of the work table with a letter in her hands and an expression he had not seen on her before, something unguarded and difficult, the expression of a person reading words they were not entirely prepared for. She looked up when he came in, and she did not straighten her expression immediately, which told him she was more affected than she might normally permit. "Bad news?" he asked, removing his coat and hanging it. She set the letter down and looked at the stove for a moment, as if the answer was somewhere in the fire. "My brother in Missouri," she said. "He's written to say our father's farm has been sold for debt. There's no longer anything to go back to." She was quiet for a moment. "I knew this was coming, eventually. I've known it since Mother passed, but—" She stopped. He pulled out the bench across from her and sat down, the way he had learned to sit down when she was talking. Fully, without preparation to leave, without the restlessness of a man waiting for his turn to speak. He looked at her and waited. "I always thought there was something to go back to," she said. "Even when I was in the worst of it, in Kansas City on the cattle drive, coming up the mountain in Pete's wagon with the beans and the flour, I always thought, at worst, there's the farm. My brother and the farm." She looked at her hands on the table. "There's no farm. Where's your brother?" "He's found work in St. Louis. He writes that he's doing well." A pause. "He's very young, 20. So he's all right?" "He's all right," she exhaled slowly. "I'm all right. It's just the feeling of the last thing closing." She paused. "You know how that feels, maybe." "Yes," he said. He did know. He had felt the door close on certain things, on Helena, on Margaret, on the idea of a different kind of life, and had found the closing not necessarily a bad thing, but always a significant thing that deserved acknowledgement before you walked forward from it. I came here to save enough to start something of my own, she said. That hasn't changed. I've been good with money. I have most of this season's wages still to collect. She was talking through it, he understood, working something out in the open that she would normally work out alone. The fact that she was doing it in front of him was its own statement. What would you start? He asked. She looked up. A boarding house kitchen, or a small restaurant if the capital ran to it, somewhere in a growing town. She paused. Livingston, maybe, or Bozeman. He nodded. Both were real towns with real futures, the kind of places where a woman with skill and determination could build something that lasted. Those are good choices, he said. She looked at him for a moment with a quality in her expression that he could not entirely read. You think I should go then? It was not quite a question. He met her eyes and held them and answered it anyway. I think you should do what you want to do, he said carefully. I think you're capable of it. A pause that was long enough to be intentional. And I think there's more than one way to build something that lasts. The fire in the stove. The wind outside, cold but not storming tonight. Her gray eyes on him with that deliberate attention. What does that mean, Elias? She asked quietly. He looked at his hands on the table, large and rough-knuckled, the hands of a man who had spent 12 years solving physical problems with physical solutions, and he thought about Brannigan's words and the morning he had carried her to the mattress and the way she laughed at the mule story and every plate of food left covered on the cookhouse table. He was not a man who made speeches. He was a man who acted. But this was not a situation that could be solved with an axe and a coil of wire, and it deserved words. I'd like you to stay, he said. Not elaborate, not ornamented. Just true. The silence between them was the kind that had weather in it. Stay, she said. In the spring, when the season ends, I'd like you to stay. He held her gaze. I have a cabin up the slope that I built well. It has a good stove and a better view than anything in Livingston or Bozeman. And He paused, because this was the part that required more precision than his usual language. I have not wanted someone to stay since Margaret and Helena, and that was a long time ago, and I am not a man who says things I don't mean. Clara was very still. Then she put her hand on the table, not touching his, but close enough that the intention was clear. Tell me about the cabin, she said. Something in him shifted and settled simultaneously, the way a well-set bone settles, the way a solid structure settles onto its foundation. It faces east, he said, so you get the morning light. She smiled, small and genuine, and he felt it in his bones. December descended on the mountain camp with the full authority of a Montana winter, and in that compression of cold and isolation and fire-lit interior hours, what had been growing between Elias and Clara stopped being a question and became simply a fact, the way certain weather facts become inescapable, not sudden but undeniable. They did not rush it. Rushing things was not in the nature of either of them, but they were together now in the way that two people who have recognized something true in each other are together even before they put a formal name to it, present to each other in a way that was different from their presence in all other circumstances. He walked her between the cookhouse and the main hall on the rope line during storms, his large hand covering hers where it gripped the rope, not because she needed guidance, but because physical proximity to her had become a thing he actively chose. She began adding small things to his breakfast plate that were particularly his, extra of the things he consistently reached for seconds of, a note of the specific spice he took in his coffee that she had observed without being told, small attentions that accumulated the way snow accumulates, quietly and with structural significance. On the first clear evening after a particularly long storm stretch, Elias took her up the slope to his cabin. The moon was out, nearly full, and the snow on the mountain was so bright under it that they barely needed the lantern he carried. She walked beside him in the good winter coat she had, and he paced himself to her pace as he always did without comment. And when they got to the cabin porch, she turned and looked down at the valley below. The camp's lights small and warm in the darkness, the whole dark world of the mountains spread out in every direction, the sky above so thick with stars that it looked like a different sky than the one over Kansas City or Missouri. And she was quiet for a long time. I see what you meant, she said finally. I thought you might. He opened the cabin and showed her the interior, which was plain but well made, and told the story of a man who built things to last rather than to impress. There was a wide stone fireplace, a good table, chairs he had made himself, shelving along 2 walls filled with trapping records and maps, and a surprising number of books that made her stop and trace their spines with one finger. She turned and looked at him. "You read a great deal," she said. "It's a long winter," he said. "What do you read?" "History, natural philosophy, some fiction." He paused. "There's a Dickens there that I've read 4 times. She laughed, and it was the real laugh, the rare one. "Which one?" "Great Expectations," he said. "Though I've often thought the title is optimistic." She laughed again, and he watched her laugh in his cabin in the firelight, and felt something so complete and so straightforward that it required no translation at all. He took her back down the slope before the cold got serious, and when they reached the cookhouse door, she turned to him in the lantern light, and he could see her face clearly, the decision in it. "Elias," she said. "Clara, I'd like to see that view in the morning, the one you described, the mist in the valley." He looked at her, reading the statement with the full attention he gave it, not moving to fill the space with anything premature. "I'll come by early," he said, "before sunrise." "Good," she said, and she went inside. He stood on the cookhouse step for a moment with the cold around him and the lantern in his hand, and he was smiling, which was not a thing his face did commonly, but which it did without self-consciousness when it was warranted. The pre-dawn of the 14th of December, 1873 was extraordinary. Elias knocked at the cookhouse door at 4:15, which was extremely early even by his standards, and Clara opened it already awake and already in her coat, which meant she had not slept much either, which pleased him in a way he did not attempt to conceal. He had brought a wool blanket in his pack for the cold and a flask of coffee, because he had understood this would be a long stand rather than a brief stop, and they went up the slope together in the perfect dark before the world began to change. They stood on his cabin porch and waited for the sky to make its transition. The valley below was invisible in the dark, and then gradually, slowly, the darkness thinned from the east, not lightening so much as changing quality, from total absence of light to the first blue possibility of it, and the mountains began to appear in silhouette against a sky that was moving through deep blue to something almost purple. The mist was there, exactly as he had described, lying in the valley like a white lake, covering the camp and the creek and the timber stands, while above the tree line everything was crisp and still, and the peaks caught the first gold light when it finally broke the horizon. Clara had not said a word in 40 minutes. She was standing beside him, close, the wool blanket over both their shoulders, and he had put his arm around her, somewhere in the progression from darkness to first light, not with announcement, simply because it was the natural thing, and she had leaned slightly into him, also without announcement. "This is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen," she said quietly, as the light turned from gold to full morning gold and the mist in the valley began to pull apart at its edges. "Yes," he said, and he was looking at her when he said it. She turned her face up to his, and he looked down at her for a moment with the same patient deliberateness he brought to everything, and then he kissed her, with the mountains and the morning light and the mist in the valley as the entire world, and she kissed him back with the directness and full presence of a person who does not do things halfway. And when they separated, she had tears on her face that were not about grief or exhaustion, but were the other kind, the kind that comes when something you had stopped believing in arrives in full, without warning or compromise. "I'm not crying," she said. "I know," he said. "I am clearly crying." "I know," he said, and he wiped her cheek with the edge of his thumb very gently, and she caught his hand and held it against her face for a moment. They stood there in the morning light until the mist was gone from the valley, and the camp below was waking up, and then she pulled back and looked at him with her clear gray eyes. "I believe I need to go start breakfast for 22 men, she said. "You do," he agreed. "But," she said. "Yes," he said, because he already knew what the but was. "I'll stay," she said. "In the spring, I'll stay." He looked at her for a moment with everything he felt arranged in his expression without concealment. "Good," he said. It was the same word she had used on the porch, and she recognized it and smiled. Winter deepened, and the mountain closed itself around the camp like a fist, and within that closed world, something warm and permanent was being built, not just in the space between Elias and Clara, but in the particular atmosphere of the whole camp, which men noticed even without being able to articulate it. A camp with good food and a settled, warm interior life is a different kind of camp than one without those things. The loggers were better humored, more cooperative, less given to the interpersonal friction that long winter confinement in rough quarters typically produced. Brannigan, who had been running camps long enough to recognize the difference between a working camp and a miserable camp, noted the improvement in his ledger book and attributed it accurately to the cook. He said as much to Elias one afternoon over the camp office wood stove. "She's transforming the place," Brannigan said. "She's good at what she does," Elias said. "That's part of it." Brannigan looked at him with the raised eyebrow expression. "The other part is you." Elias said nothing. "You are less difficult to be around," Brannigan said judiciously, marginally. This was, from Brannigan, an extravagant compliment. Christmas came to the mountain camp in the form of a modest but entirely sincere celebration organized by Clara, who had been planning it quietly for weeks. She had requested from Pete's last supply run before the deep freeze specific items: dried cranberries, extra sugar, a tin of cocoa powder, a length of ribbon, and she had spent the 2 days before Christmas making things that the men of that camp had not expected to encounter in the Montana timber country: proper pies with latticed tops, a pot of sweet cocoa that she served with the gravity of ceremony, and a Christmas pudding of improvised but effective composition that she served with whiskey sauce and presented with a small sprig of pine on top. The camp gathered in the dining hall on Christmas evening and ate and were quiet with something that was not the usual supper silence, but something closer to gratitude. And old Pete raised his tin cup and said something about it being the best Christmas he could remember without specifying where the previous best ones had been, and several of the men agreed with a feeling that they expressed imprecisely but genuinely. Elias sat beside Clara at the table that night, which was a departure from his usual position at the end, and their shoulders were touching. And when Brannigan led a very rough-voiced, largely tuneless rendition of a Christmas hymn that the loggers all somehow knew, Clara joined in with a clear, true voice that made the men around her go briefly quiet in surprise and then sing louder to compensate. And Elias listened to her voice and looked at the ceiling of the dining hall and felt something in his chest that he could only describe as full. After supper, he went to the wood store he had built behind his cabin and retrieved the small package he had prepared and been waiting to give her. It was not elaborate. He had carved it himself from a piece of mountain ash that had fallen in the summer storm, a small figure of a woman standing at a stove, no larger than his fist. And if the figure was not polished or delicate, it was entirely recognizable for what it was and entirely recognizable in its subject. He had spent evenings on it over the past 3 weeks, working at the cabin table after dark, and it was the first thing he had made for someone else in 12 years. He brought it to the cookhouse after the men had dispersed, and when he handed it to her, she turned it in the lamplight for a long time before she looked up at him. "You made this," she said. "Yes." She looked at it again. Then she set it down carefully on the work table and crossed the space between them and put her arms around him, which required her to reach up considerably given the differential in their heights, and he put his arms around her and held her against his chest in the cookhouse warmth. And neither of them said anything for a while because nothing needed to be said. He had not held anyone against him in a very long time, and the solidity of her, the warmth and realness of her, was something he felt throughout his entire body, the way you feel sudden warmth after extended cold as both relief and revelation. "It's the finest gift I've ever been given," she said into the flannel of his shirt. "It's just a carving," he said. "It's not just a carving," she said, which was also true. He tucked the top of her head under his chin, and they stood like that in the Christmas cookhouse until the stove burned lower and the cold outside reminded them of its presence through the gaps in the logs. January in the mountains was its own education. The logging work slowed because certain operations required waiting for the packed snow of deep winter before the timber could be run, and the men had more time on their hands, which created different dynamics in the camp. There was more card playing, more storytelling, more of the particular male restlessness that develops when physical men are confined to indoor idleness. There were a few disputes, nothing serious, the kind of friction that erupts when men are crowded and cold and have been looking at the same faces for months. There was one incident at supper in the second week of January when two of the younger loggers, heated by argument about something that had started as a card game and evolved into a matter of personal grievance, began to push each other toward physical altercation at the dinner table. The dining hall went quiet in the particular bracing way. It goes quiet when something is about to escalate, and Clara, who was carrying the bread basket, set it down on the table with a single firm sound and addressed both men by name in a voice that was not loud but was entirely clear and completely calm. "Silas, Marcus, sit down and eat your supper." The specific authority in her voice, the kind that comes not from volume but from complete certainty of its own legitimacy, worked on both men the way it had worked on fractious boarders in her mother's establishment for years. They sat down. Silas made a comment under his breath that was not entirely deferential, and Elias, from his place at the table, looked at Silas with his quiet, total attention for approximately 3 seconds, after which Silas appeared to reconsider the wisdom of further commentary. The meal continued. Clara, bringing coffee around afterward, stopped at Elias's elbow on her way past. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I didn't do anything," he said. "You looked at him," she said. "That's not doing anything. In your case it is." He took his coffee cup to hide the fact that something in his expression was in danger of becoming what could only be called fond. February brought a strange interlude, a week of unusual warmth that the old hands called a false thaw, when the temperature climbed above freezing for 4 days running and the snow in the lower valley began to loosen, and the whole mountain smelled of mud and cold water. The loggers were energized by it, the way men in long confinement are energized by anything that feels like a loosening of constraints. Elias, who knew the mountains better than any man in the camp, advised caution, because false thaws in February meant the snowpack had weakened and the creek banks would be unstable. And sure enough, on the third day of warm weather, a section of creek bank on the west side of the valley collapsed and took a portion of the lower timber bridge with it. The repair took 3 days, and involved most of the camp's able men and much of Elias's particular expertise in improvised engineering, because the bridge needed to be functional before the next legitimate thaw, which would come in March, or the whole eastern timber operation would lose weeks of critical work time. He supervised the repair with the focused authority of a man who knew precisely what needed to happen, directing the work with minimal words and maximum clarity. And Clara watched him from the cookhouse window on the second day, as he stood knee-deep in the half-frozen creek directing the placement of the new bridge timber, and felt a particular quality of admiration that she recognized honestly as having nothing to do with the engineering and everything to do with the man. He came in that evening cold to the core, his boots and trouser legs soaked through despite his gaiters, and Clara had, without it being remarked upon, moved his supper to the small table beside the stove, and left a set of dry socks and a dry flannel on the chair, retrieved from the supply bunkhouse without being asked, because she had been watching and she understood what was needed. He changed his socks by the stove and ate his supper in the warmth she had prepared for him, and looked across at her where she was cleaning the kitchen, and he said, "Clara." She turned. "I want to marry you," he said. Not as a question, not as an elaborate proposal, as a straightforward declaration of a fact that had been true for long enough that continuing to not say it seemed dishonest. She held the cleaning cloth in her hands and looked at him for a moment. Then she set it down and came to the small table and sat across from him. "You have considered this?" she said. It was not a question either. "I've considered it since December," he said, "maybe November." "And?" "I want to marry you," he said again, "if you want to marry me." She looked at him with those gray eyes that saw everything clearly, and he held still under the regard because he had nothing to hide and was not in the habit of performing anything he did not feel. "What would it look like?" she said. "The cabin," he said. "We could expand it, add a second room. The space is there to the north side. I have the skills and the timber. You could keep cooking for the camp if you wanted, for the season, or you could stop when you liked. We could go to Bozeman in the spring, to the Justice of the Peace, before the camp season begins again." He paused. "Or if you wanted a church, there's one in Livingston." He paused again. "Whatever you want." She was quiet for what felt like a long time, but was probably only the duration of a breath. "The cabin," she said. "Yes. You said it faces east for the morning light. It does. And the view in the morning. Same view, he said. Better from the bedroom window. She looked at her hands on the table, then back at him. Yes, she said. I want to marry you, Elias Colt. He reached across the small table and covered her hands with both of his hands enormous against hers, warm from the stove, rough from the creek work. And they sat like that in the fire, warmth for a moment, and it was simple and sufficient and exactly right. I'll get you a ring in Bozeman, he said. I don't need a ring. I know you don't need it, he said. I want to give it to you. She turned one of her hands over and laced her fingers through his. All right, she said. Get me a ring. Brannigan, told the following morning, produced a bottle of Irish whiskey from the bottom drawer of his office desk, with the efficiency of a man who has been saving it for exactly this kind of occasion, and poured 2 measures and handed one to Elias and said, I told you. And Elias drank the whiskey and said, You did. And they left it at that, which was the exact right amount. The men of the camp were told at supper by Clara, matter-of-factly, in the way she delivered all significant information. There was a substantial amount of noise from the assembled loggers, of the congratulatory variety, and old Pete Hensley, who had driven Clara up the mountain in the supply wagon in the first week of October with his tobacco and his silence, looked at Elias across the table with an expression that was the closest thing to demonstrative emotion anyone had ever observed on Pete Hensley's face, and raised his coffee cup, and Elias raised his. The remainder of winter passed with the particular quality of time that moves differently when a person has something to look forward to in a genuine and unambiguous way. March came with the legitimate thaw, the mountain releasing its grip slowly, the creek rising and the mud coming, and the first impossible green appearing at the south-facing lower slopes. The logging work accelerated into the frantic productivity of a crew trying to make up for winter delays, and Elias ran the trap lines hard in the last weeks of proper trapping season, bringing in a late-season take that he sold in Billings during the spring supply run for a sum that he added to the careful savings of 12 years of mountain work. He had enough. He had known for several years that he had enough, which was partly why he had never examined too closely what he was saving for. Now he knew what it was for, and the knowledge gave the number a meaning that was better than the number by itself. April 15th, 1874. The camp season wound formally down, the loggers collecting their wages from Brannigan and beginning the dispersal that happened every spring, back toward towns and families and whatever lives the mountain had kept them from during the winter. Brannigan offered Clara a contract for the following season at an increased wage, which she accepted, and he offered Elias the same arrangement they had maintained for 3 years, which Elias also accepted, which meant they would both be back on the mountain in October. But first, Bozeman. They came down the mountain together on the 14th, on good horses, Elias on his own bay gelding, a large, steady animal that suited him, and Clara on a dun mare borrowed from the camp string, the kind of horse she had always handled well, and the ride down through the spring valley, the air warm with the particular freshness that only exists in the mountains in April when the snow is melting and the earth is releasing everything it has been holding since October, was one of those stretches of time that both of them would remember for the rest of their lives in specific detail. The way the light came through the new birch leaves, the sound of the creek running fast and clear below the trail, the way Clara laughed at something he said about the dun mare's opinion of loose rocks. Bozeman was a real town by 1874, with brick buildings on Main Street and a newspaper and a proper hotel and a justice of the peace who had married people in every variety of circumstance and received Elias Colt and Clara Mayfield with the brisk professional welcome of a man who takes his civic functions seriously. They stood before him in his office on the afternoon of April 16th with Brannigan, who had come down the mountain with them specifically for this purpose, as the witness, and the words of the ceremony were short and plain and entirely adequate. When the justice said the words about rings, Elias reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring from the jeweler 2 doors down Main Street, where he had been that morning while Clara was at the dressmaker having her traveling dress pressed. The ring was a simple gold band with a small oval piece of Montana sapphire, blue-gray and clear, set simply and cleanly without excessive adornment, and it was the right size because he had asked her the week before, under the pretense of practical inquiry, the approximate width of her fingers. Clara looked at it for a moment before she looked at him, and the expression on her face was one he would carry his whole life. "It's the color of the mountains in the morning," she said. "I thought so when I saw it," he said. He put it on her finger, and it fit, and Brannigan produced a flask from his breast pocket that was clearly not his first provision of this sort, and the justice of the peace accepted a small measure with the air of a man who had learned that certain ceremonies were improved by Irish whiskey. They stayed 2 nights at the Bozeman Hotel, which was not a grand establishment, but was clean and warm and had good beds. And on the evening of the first night, Elias and Clara sat at the small table in their room, with the window open to the spring night air, and ate the hotel supper, and talked about the cabin, about the north side expansion, about the window Clara wanted on the east wall of the new room for the morning light, about the kitchen garden she was already planning for the slope below the porch, about the possibility of eventually building a small proper kitchen structure adjacent to the main cabin. "You could have a real kitchen," he said. "I'll build you what you want." "I want a window over the work table," she said immediately, which told him she had been thinking about this for a while. "Done," he said. "And room for a proper cold storage, properly dug, not just a shelf." "Done," he said. "And a porch facing south as well as east," she said. He looked at her with an expression that might have contained a degree of amusement. "You have been thinking about this house for some time." "Since December," she said, which was the same month he had given her as the beginning of his own certainty, and something in the alignment of it satisfied them both deeply. They went back to the mountain in the second week of May, the camp still quiet and in its spring condition, and Elias began the cabin expansion with the methodical determination of a man who is building something for someone he intends to make happy, and does not intend to do it imperfectly. He worked from sunrise until the day's light gave out, and Clara worked alongside him where she could, handing timber lengths, holding the plumb line, mixing the mortar for the foundation extension with an efficiency that told him she was not a woman who considered domestic work the boundary of her capabilities. By July, the new room was framed, roofed, and beginning to take its interior form. By August, the east window was installed, and the morning light came through it exactly as promised, full and golden and direct, lying across the wood floor in a long rectangle that moved through the room as the sun moved, which Clara stood in the middle of on the first morning and tilted her face up to with her eyes closed, and Elias stood in the doorway and watched her and felt something so uncomplicated and so complete that it required no analysis and no language. The summer of 1874 on the mountain was one of the best of Elias's life. The trapping season in the summer months was lighter, the real work being trap maintenance and the territory preparations for autumn, which gave him more time at the cabin, and more time at the cabin meant more time with Clara. They fell into the rhythms of a shared life with a naturalness that was perhaps surprising for two people who had both been deeply solitary, but was in fact logical. They were both people of habit and routine and competence, and their habits and routines and competences were complementary in the way that good tools complement each other in a well-organized kit. She learned which parts of the mountain made him difficult to reach, and respected them. He learned that she needed an uninterrupted hour in the morning with her coffee before she was fully available to the world, and he provided it without making it a thing. She began the kitchen garden on the south slope, and it grew in the long summer light with a productivity that surprised even her, and she put up preserves and dried herbs through August with an organization and thoroughness that he watched with something close to reverence, because it was the same quality of thoroughness he brought to his own work, and he had not before seen it in someone else up close. He loved her. This was not new information to him by summer, but the summer gave the love more texture, more depth, more detail, the way knowing a mountain gets more detailed as you travel it more frequently. He loved her practical intelligence and her economy of emotion and the rare laugh. He loved the way she read his books in the evenings, sitting in the chair he had made for her specifically to be the right height for reading, with her feet tucked under her and the lamplight on her hair. He loved the carving of herself that she had placed on the kitchen shelf in the cabin, and somehow the fact that she had put it there, that small, inelegant figure in a place of prominence, was more affecting to him than almost anything she had ever said to him. She told him she loved him first, which surprised him slightly, and she knew it would, which was partly why she did it. She said it on a late August evening when they were sitting on the east-facing porch in the last warmth of the summer day, the sky going extraordinary colors over the peaks, and she said it in the direct, unadorned way she said everything true, without preamble or performance. He turned to look at her, and she met his eyes with the clear, deliberate regard that was one of the things he loved, and he said, "I love you, Clara," with the same directness and the same full intention. "I know," she said. "You know," he said. "You carried me to a mattress the first week I arrived," she said, "and you fixed all my door hinges. I've known for some time." He looked at the sunset for a moment and then back at her. "The door hinges gave it away." "The door hinges confirmed it," she said. "The mattress gave it away." He reached across and took her hand, and they sat on the porch until the colors left the sky, and the peaks went dark, and the first stars appeared, and neither of them said anything more about it because it was already said, and it was already true, and it was going to remain both of those things. The second camp season began in October of 1874, with both of them established at the mountain camp, Clara back in the cookhouse with an authority and efficiency that had only increased over the winter and spring, and Elias back on his territory work and trap lines. But the quality of their lives was fundamentally different from the previous year, in the way that all things are different after something important has been fully decided and acted upon. They went home together to the cabin at the end of each camp day. They ate supper at the cabin table. They woke together to the morning light through the east window, and on clear mornings they stood on the porch and watched the mist in the valley below, and it was their view now, belonging to both of them, and it was no less extraordinary for being familiar. Winter came again, this time with them ready for it, the cabin stocked and weathered and proving itself the solid structure Elias had built it to be. Clara had the kitchen garden's preserves on the shelves and the herbs hanging dry from the rafters, and the cabin smelled in a way that Elias would spend the rest of his life associating with home. Dried rosemary and pine smoke, and the particular warm sweetness of a wood stove with bread in the oven. In the early spring of 1875, Clara told him she was pregnant. She told him on a morning in March, with a directness and composure that was entirely characteristic, sitting across from him at the breakfast table with her coffee between her hands. He was still for a moment, the way he was still when he was processing something significant, and then he looked at her with an expression that was more unguarded than anything she had previously seen on his face, something wide open and fully exposed, something that was not quite any single definable emotion, but contained all of them at once. He came around the table and crouched in front of her chair and took both her hands in his and looked up at her face and said nothing at all for a moment, and she looked down at him and waited, because she knew how he did this, and she was not a woman who needed filling silences to trust them. "Are you well?" he said finally. "I'm very well," she said. "Do you need—" He stopped, cataloging the list of everything he might need to provide, everything that needed to be addressed and prepared for, the practical cascade that was his natural response to new circumstances. "I need what I have," she said. "I need you, and the cabin, and the mountain." She paused. "And eventually some things for a baby. But not immediately." He pressed his forehead against her hands, which were folded inside his, and she felt the weight of it, the full, heavy, warm weight of his relief and his joy and his love, and she curved her free hand around the back of his head where his long, dark hair was still warm from sleep, and they stayed like that in the March morning kitchen, while the stove crackled and the baby began to exist between them as something real and named and waited for. The pregnancy changed the rhythm of the camp season somewhat. Clara kept cooking through the summer and early autumn because she was capable, and the work agreed with her, and the camp needed her, and she had no intention of being treated as an invalid for a natural condition. But Elias was attentive in the specific ways that mattered, present when she needed presence, and unobtrusive when she needed to work, managing the distance between anxious overcare and neglect with the same calibrated attention he brought to everything. He built the baby's cradle from mountain ash, the same wood he had used for the carving, and he spent weeks on it, treating the wood with the same patience Beaumont, the French-trained chef, had taught Clara to apply to bread. The cradle was smooth and solid, and rocked with a steadiness that the child would later grow up never knowing was exactly calibrated, because Elias had tested it approximately 40 times before he was satisfied. Their son was born in November of 1875, in the cabin, in the room with the east window, with the camp's one woman of medical experience, a logger's wife who had been a midwife before her husband took a timber contract in Montana, in attendance, and with Elias present throughout in the steady, immovable way, he was present through everything that mattered. The birth was hard, as first births often are, but Clara was strong in ways that went beyond the physical, and she was attended well. And when the baby arrived, squalling and red-faced and furious at the general situation, Elias received his son in his large hands with a gentleness that made the midwife stop what she was doing and look for a moment with an expression she would later describe to her husband as something she was glad she had been there to see. They named him Thomas, for Clara's young brother in St. Louis, with Jacob added for Elias's father, gone since 1862. Thomas Jacob Colt. He had his mother's gray eyes, which Elias noticed immediately, and which pleased him in a way he did not entirely understand but entirely felt. Thomas was a child of the mountain from his first breath, and the mountain suited him. He was calm and alert and curious, and he grew through his first year in the cabin and the camp and on the slopes with the ease of something that was native to its environment. The loggers of the camp, who came back each season and found the baby and then the toddler at Clara's heels in the cookhouse or on Elias's back during the morning rounds, adopted the child with the collective warmth of a large, rough family that had not expected the softness that a small person introduces into even the hardest-working men's daily lives. Old Pete Hensley, who had started speaking more since Clara's arrival, a development the other men noted with varying degrees of surprised interest, made Thomas a set of small wooden animals during the winter of 1876, carved from scraps with surprising artistry, and brought them up the mountain on the first supply run of the season, with the shy exactness of a man doing something generous for the first time in a long while. Clara thanked him with the warmth she had always had for Pete, who had been the first person to show her any version of the mountain, and Elias shook Pete's hand, and Pete nodded once and went back to his wagon, satisfied. The summer of 1877 brought a development none of them had anticipated, an offer for Elias from a land company operating out of Helena, which had identified his 12 years of territorial knowledge and his specific skills as something worth formalizing. The offer was for the position of territorial guide and land assessor, working in the spring and summer months between March and August, which would have left the autumn and winter free for the mountain. The pay was significant by any standard and would have changed their financial situation from comfortable to genuinely secure. Elias brought it to Clara the same evening he received it, which was how he handled everything of joint consequence. He laid the letter on the table and sat down and waited for her to read it, which she did with her usual complete attention. She set it down and looked at him. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to know what you think," he said. "I think it's a significant sum," she said. "I think spring and summer away from the mountain is a long time." She paused. "I think you know this country better than anyone, and the work would use your skills well." Another pause. "I also think we have Thomas in the cabin and a life here that is not improved by your absence for 5 months a year." He nodded slowly, in the way that meant he had been thinking the same things and was satisfied to have them confirmed. "If there were children after Thomas," he said carefully, "I would not want to be absent for 5 months." She looked at him steadily, and something in her expression softened in a way he recognized and valued. "No," she said, "neither would I." He declined the Helena offer the following day, with a letter so well worded that it surprised the land company representative, who had not expected a mountain trapper to have such a clean command of formal writing. And he went back to the cabin to find Clara at the east window in the morning light, Thomas on her hip, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at them both and felt the rightness of the decision settle through him the way warmth settles after cold. He crossed the kitchen and kissed his wife and took his son, who grabbed immediately for his father's long hair with the determined enthusiasm of a 2-year-old, and Clara laughed the real laugh, and the cabin was full of it. Clara announced her second pregnancy in the summer of 1878 with the same composed directness as the first, though this time Elias's reaction was quicker and more immediately joyful, because the fear of the first time had been replaced by knowledge that she was strong and capable and would be fine, and what he felt first now was straightforward happiness rather than happiness wrapped in anxiety. He picked her up, which he had never done in daylight and soberly, and she made a surprised sound and then laughed. "Put me down, Elias Colt," she said, but she was laughing. "In a moment," he said. He put her down with care, and she straightened her apron and looked at him with the expression she wore when she was trying not to let her full delight show, which he had become expert at reading. "Are you going to build another piece of furniture?" she asked. "A rocking chair," he said immediately, "for the south porch. You'll need somewhere to sit in the evenings." "I always need somewhere to sit in the evenings. Now you'll need it more." The second child was born in February of 1879, a daughter this time, which produced in Elias a quality of tenderness he had not known he was carrying, and which arrived with the full force of a complete surprise. They named her Rose, for no particular literary reason, but because Clara had said it the moment she saw her, and it had immediately and obviously been correct. Rose had her father's dark hair and her mother's gray eyes, a combination that produced in the assembled camp a series of declarations about her future personal impact that were both extravagant and logistically premature, given that she was 3 days old. Thomas received his sister with the grave seriousness of a 3-year-old who has been told about something important for months and has formed opinions. He looked at her in the cradle, which had been moved to accommodate the new occupant, and then looked at his father with an expression that sought some form of confirmation. "She's small," Thomas said. "She is," Elias agreed. "Will she stay small?" "No," Elias said. "She'll grow." Thomas considered this. "All right," he said, with the air of someone issuing provisional acceptance, and went back to the wooden animals Pete had made him, leaving the adults to their business. The years on the mountain accumulated with the quality of good things that accumulate, not monotonously, because the mountains are never monotonous, but with a richness that deepened as it layered, each year adding to the one before it in a structure that was becoming something real and permanent and entirely their own. The camp seasons continued, Elias's reputation as the best man in the territory for mountain work, growing to a point where Brannigan began sending men to him for secondary training, a role Elias took on with the practical thoroughness he brought to everything, and Clara encouraged with the clear-eyed recognition of a woman who understands that a man whose skills are used fully is a man who is content. Clara's cooking, meanwhile, had become something of a legend in the wider territory, the kind of reputation that spreads not through advertisement, but through the testimony of men who have eaten her food and carry the memory of it into whatever next corner of the wilderness they go. There had been further offers: a hotel in Bozeman, a restaurant investor from Helena, a cattle rancher's wife who had heard about the elk stew and wanted a personal cook, and Clara had declined all of them with the polite certainty of a woman who had precisely the life she wanted and no interest in trading it for a different one. She had not stopped cooking with ambition. She cooked with more ambition now than she had in Kansas City or on the cattle drive, but it was the ambition of a person cooking for something real, for 22 men who depended on her, for a husband who ate her food with a consistent attention that was its own form of appreciation, for 2 children who were growing up understanding that a well-made meal was a form of love, and increasingly for the camp's growing tradition of special occasions on which Clara was expected to produce something remarkable, and always did. In the winter of 1880, when Thomas was 5 and Rose was almost 2, Elias finished the kitchen structure he had been planning since their first summer together. The proper attached kitchen with the window over the work table, the cold storage dug and walled with the smooth fieldstone he had been collecting from the creek for 2 seasons, the south-facing window that let the afternoon light in at an angle that Clara had specified precisely and he had delivered exactly. He walked her through it on the morning it was complete, and she stood at the work table window and looked at the view, the slope below the cabin, the valley below that, the mountains in every direction, and she ran her hands along the top of the work table, which he had sanded smooth and finished with linseed oil, and she looked at the shelves he had built to exactly the dimensions of the vessels she used most, and she looked at the cold storage door that opened with the balanced ease of something well hung, and she turned to him with her gray eyes bright. "This is exactly what I said," she told him. "I know," he said, down to the depth of the shelf and the angle of the window. "I listened carefully," he said. She crossed to him and put her hands on his chest, looking up at him in the morning light that was coming through the window over the work table. He covered her hands with his, large and warm, the same hands that had carried her across a cookhouse floor in the dark when she was a stranger sleeping in the cold, and they looked at each other in the room he had built for her, and she thought about all the rooms she had cooked in, Missouri, Kansas City, Wyoming, this mountain cookhouse, and understood with the full clarity of a woman who has seen enough of the world to know what is rare when she has it, that this was the room she would work in for the rest of her life, and the man in front of her was the person she would stand in rooms with for the rest of her life, and that the rest of her life, however long it ran, was going to be the best of it. "I love you," she said. "I know," he said. He smiled. It was still rare enough to be worth noting. "I love you, Clara Colt." "You always say the whole name," she said. "It's a good name," he said. "It is," she agreed. "It's a very good name." Rose appeared in the kitchen doorway at this point, having escaped the supervision of Thomas, who was supposed to be keeping her occupied by the cabin stove and had apparently failed in this duty. She was wearing one of Thomas's hats, which was too large and sitting at a complete angle over one ear, and she had in her hand one of Pete Hensley's carved wooden animals, the bear, which was her specific favorite, and she looked at her parents with the imperious satisfaction of a 2-year-old who has located the people she wanted. "Mama," she announced. "Yes, my love," said Clara. "Bear," said Rose, presenting the bear for inspection. "Yes," said Clara, "that's the bear." Rose considered the new kitchen with the evaluating expression she had inherited from her father. Then she walked in, sat down in the middle of the floor with the bear, and began a conversation with it in the private language of very small children, entirely at home. Elias and Clara looked at each other over their daughter's dark head, and both of them were smiling now, and the morning light came through the work table window at exactly the angle Clara had specified, and the cold storage held the spring butter and the last of the winter's cured meats, and the mountain held the cabin, and the cabin held all of them. And outside the window, the mist was in the valley, and the peaks were in the early gold light, and the whole world looked, as it always did from this particular porch, from this particular window, in this particular company, entirely and continuously possible. They had 3 more camp seasons after that, Elias and Clara together on the mountain, building the kind of life that needs no advertisement and no apology and no alteration. Thomas grew into a boy with his father's quietness and his mother's precision, already learning the trap lines at 7, already helping in the kitchen at 5 with the focused seriousness of a child who understands that being given real work is a form of respect. Rose grew into herself with a personality that was entirely her own and delightfully unpredictable. Her father's deliberateness turned somehow sideways into a kind of mischief that kept the whole camp perpetually slightly off balance in the most entertaining possible way. Old Pete Hensley retired from the supply run in the spring of 1882 and came to say goodbye at the cabin on his way down the mountain for the last time. He sat at Clara's kitchen table and drank 3 cups of her coffee and ate 2 pieces of the apple cake that had been baking when he arrived, and he said more during that one visit than he had said in the entire 4 years of their acquaintance combined, talking about the territory in the years before the camps, about his wife back in Minnesota, who had died in 1865 and whom he had not spoken about before, about what the mountain country looked like to a man who had been watching it for 20 years. Before he left, he pressed a folded paper into Clara's hand without speaking, and when she unfolded it later, she found a letter in Pete's careful, unpracticed handwriting that said, simply, that driving her up the mountain in October of 1873 had been the best supply run he had ever made, and that he was glad to know that the country still held people in it who were worth the country. Clara read it twice at the kitchen table and then went out to the south porch, and when Elias came and found her there, she handed it to him without speaking, and he read it and folded it back carefully and set it on the porch rail. "Pete," he said. "Pete," she agreed. They stood on the porch in the late summer evening with the shadows long on the valley, and they were together in the easy, full, complete way of people who have chosen each other so many times and in so many circumstances that the choice is no longer a decision, but a nature. By 1883, the cabin with its additions was a proper home by any standard, set into the mountain's north slope with the solidity of a structure that had been built to last and had been maintained with love. The east-facing window still held the morning light. The south porch still took the afternoon sun. The kitchen was exactly what Clara had described from the work table window, and it produced, year after year, the kind of food that made the men who ate it feel fortunate to be alive in the same decade as the woman who made it. Elias was 44 in 1883 and had not slowed in any meaningful way, though the lines of the mountains were more deeply written on his face now, and the dark hair had some silver in it that Clara told him was distinguished, and he told her was inconvenient, since it made him more visible on the ridge during hunting season, which he pointed out was an objection that said something specific about the ordering of his concerns. Clara was 33 in 1883 and was exactly who she had been becoming since before the mountain, the same directness, the same economy of self, the same practical intelligence and rare, extraordinary laugh. But she was more fully herself now, in the way that people become more fully themselves when they are living the right life, when the work they do and the person they love and the place they inhabit are all in alignment with who they actually are. She was teaching Thomas to make bread that winter. Not teaching in the formal instructional sense, but in the way that Clara taught everything, by doing it in front of him and including him in the doing and answering his questions with the complete unsimplified accuracy of a person who believes children are capable of understanding things properly if you explain them properly. Thomas, at 8, was working the dough with the focused expression of his father, and Rose, at 4, was sitting on the kitchen counter with Pete's carved bear and her running commentary on the proceedings, and Elias was at the table with the season's trapping records, and the stove was going, and the kitchen smelled of bread in progress, and this was it. This was the whole thing. Elias looked up from the trapping records and across the kitchen at his wife and his children and his mountain, and the totality of it settled through him like the warmth after cold, like the first morning light through an east-facing window, like the particular silence of the high ridge in February that had texture and pressed against the thoughts and was not empty but full. He had carried a woman across a cookhouse floor in the dark, very gently, setting her boots beside her when he was done, and everything that mattered had followed from that, in the natural, inevitable way that true things follow from true things. Thomas punched the bread dough with appropriate force and looked up at his mother for confirmation. "Good," Clara said, "just like that." Outside, the mountain went on being enormous and cold and beautiful, holding its valley in the morning mist, holding its people in the way that the right places hold the right people, not by trapping them, but by being worth staying for, which is an entirely different and much better thing. The bread rose. The fire held. The morning would come again through the east window, as it always did and always would, and find them there.